Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. Chicago, April 2019. A 19-year-old woman, heavily pregnant and just weeks from giving birth, vanished in broad daylight. Her name was Marlene Ochoa Lopez. She was a student, a wife, and the mother of a young child. That same afternoon, a newborn was brought to a local hospital, but the woman who claimed to be the mother showed no signs of recent childbirth. That contradiction marked the beginning of one of the most disturbing crimes in recent American history. On April 23rd, Marlene attended classes at Latino Youth High School. By mid-afternoon, she told her husband she would make a short stop to pick up baby clothes offered through an online group for young mothers. Her last known phone activity was recorded around 3 o'clock. Within minutes, her digital trail went dark. Later that evening, Marlene failed to return home. Her husband tried calling her, but the calls went unanswered. Family members began reaching out to friends and searching familiar places. The absence of any response raised alarm quickly. By nightfall, police were notified. Detectives began their first checks. Marlene's black Honda Civic was located near West 77th Place, parked at the curb. The doors were locked, her purse and belongings were inside, and there was no visible sign of a struggle. No forced entry. No movement recorded after her phone went silent. These were what investigators call quiet anomalies, the absence of expected signs that usually help explain a disappearance. Her family pushed back against any suggestion she might have left voluntarily. They told police she was dedicated to her young son, excited about the upcoming birth, and had no reason to disappear. For investigators, the lack of phone activity combined with the intact vehicle moved the case quickly into high-risk territory. During routine log checks, officers noticed something else. Around the same time Marlene vanished, a 911 call came from a house on the very same block. The report claimed a woman had suddenly given birth at home, and the newborn was struggling to breathe. Paramedics responded within minutes, transporting the infant to Advocate Christ Medical Center in Oak Lawn. The woman who identified herself as the mother was also taken in for evaluation. At that moment, these were two separate reports: a missing pregnant teenager and a medical emergency involving a newborn. But the timing and geography matched too closely to ignore. Detectives noted the connection quietly and prepared to investigate further. By the next morning, the case had already escalated. Investigators pulled Marlene's call records. The final entries showed contact with her husband and then an arrangement with a woman from the online mothers group. Surveillance canvases of the neighborhood were limited, but officers documented the addresses around 77th Place. They also flagged the residence where the 911 call originated. In missing person cases, the first 24 hours are decisive. Here, every indicator pointed away from a voluntary disappearance. Instead, the silence of her phone, the location of her vehicle, and the coincidental appearance of a newborn hours later combined into a picture investigators could not ignore. Marlene's family organized searches on foot, passing out flyers with her photo. Volunteers retraced her route from school toward the southwest side. Still, there were no sightings, no calls, no credible leads from the public. Silence became its own kind of evidence. Inside the precinct, detectives began piecing together what they had: a young expectant mother missing without trace, a car abandoned, no phone activity, and a newborn whose supposed mother showed no signs of labor. The connection between those two storylines was not yet proven, but investigators knew it had to be tested. By the end of that first week, the case was treated as a high-priority investigation. Detectives secured subpoenas for digital communications and medical records. They prepared to examine every contact Marlene had in the days before her disappearance. What began as a routine missing person entry was now under active suspicion of being something far worse. This was how the investigation started, with a teenager gone, a car parked in silence, and a medical emergency that didn't add up. In cases like this, it is often the quiet inconsistencies, the phone that never turns back on, the car that holds no signs of travel, that lead investigators toward the truth. The search for a missing teenager had shifted into something far darker. Once the body was transported from a residential lot on West 77th Place, the focus turned to the morgue. In Chicago, the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office is where silence meets evidence. It's where unanswered questions from the street are translated into measurable facts. Marlene Ochoa Lopez's remains arrived sealed, tagged, and documented. Every transfer from the crime scene unit to the medical examiner's intake was logged step by step. Chain of custody in homicide cases is non-negotiable. Each seal on the transport bag was recorded, every handover signed. Detectives, prosecutors, and eventually a jury would rely on the assurance that nothing was disturbed, nothing was altered, nothing was lost. Forensic pathologists began with the external examination. The body was badly decomposed after weeks of concealment in outdoor conditions, but enough remained for crucial findings. Around the neck, investigators documented clear impressions consistent with a cable or cord. Ligature strangulation was evident. The marks matched a linear, firm object drawn tight under pressure. Internal examination confirmed the same: damage to the soft tissue structures of the neck, including hemorrhaging in muscles and fractures to the cartilage, pointed to death by asphyxiation. Toxicology testing returned negative. There were no drugs or alcohol in her system. Importantly, no significant defensive wounds were documented. The absence of torn fingernails, bruised knuckles, or disrupted skin suggested she had been restrained or caught by surprise. That silence in the body, what was not found, mattered as much as what was. The second layer of the autopsy was unavoidable. Marlene had been 9 months pregnant at the time of her disappearance. The uterus was empty, the incision was crude, carried out after death. Forensic investigators recorded it clinically, but every examiner in that room understood what it meant. A baby had been removed and the mother had not survived. Samples were preserved: tissue slides, DNA swabs, toxicology fluids, each labeled, stored, and locked. These would become the backbone of the case file. The photographs, clinical and sterile, would later be shown in court. They were not intended to shock. They existed to prove beyond question what had happened. Detectives in the observation area took notes. The cause of death was now formally listed as homicide by ligature strangulation. The manner was deliberate, not accidental. Combined with the evidence of the post-mortem incision, the case had shifted fully. This was no longer a missing person inquiry. It was a capital crime. Investigators then turned attention to the infant who had been hospitalized weeks earlier. DNA samples from Marlene were matched against the newborn. The result came back confirmed. The baby was biologically hers and her husband's. The child's survival was in question, but the forensic link was now established. That connection tied the morgue to the hospital, and both back to the address on 77th Place. Chain of custody continued outside the autopsy room. Reports were filed the same day, logged into the state's electronic case management system, and shared with lead detectives. Evidence technicians secured the ligature, trace samples, and clothing remnants. Each was preserved as potential trial exhibits. For the medical examiner, the job was to describe, not speculate. The report avoided words like motive or why. It stuck to what could be proven: strangulation, full-term pregnancy, post-mortem extraction, no defensive injuries, and no substances in her system. That clinical tone would later stand in contrast to the emotional testimony from her family, but it was the backbone of the prosecution's case. From an investigative standpoint, the findings did more than confirm a crime. They narrowed possibilities. The absence of forced entry at her vehicle, combined with the lack of defensive wounds, suggested Marlene had entered a location voluntarily, with trust. Once inside, she was restrained quickly and killed efficiently. That pointed detectives toward premeditation. In homicide work, investigators often ask, did the data line up too cleanly? Sometimes the absence of expected evidence is its own red flag. Here, the silence around the victim, no calls, no struggle, no last-minute attempt to flee, raised suspicion that the crime was carried out under false pretenses that left her unprepared. Detectives now had a critical anchor. The body told them how Marlene died. What remained was to establish who had access, who had motive, and how a missing person case and a hospital intake could possibly align. Behind the sterile walls of the medical examiner's office, the case became undeniable. A young woman had been strangled. Her unborn child had been taken. The family's worst fears were confirmed with clinical precision. For detectives, the autopsy closed one set of questions and opened another. Who had orchestrated an act this calculated? By the time autopsy results confirmed homicide, detectives were already pursuing another thread. They had logged a 911 call from the same block where Marlon's car was found. That call was not about a missing woman. It was about a newborn in medical distress. In homicide work, coincidences this sharp don't last long. They demand to be tested. The 911 audio was reviewed. The caller, later identified as Clarissa Figueroa, told dispatchers that she had just delivered a baby at home and that the child was not breathing properly. Emergency crews were dispatched within minutes. Paramedics noted the odd scene immediately. The woman claiming to be the mother had no signs of recent labor, no bleeding, no discharge, no physical markers. Yet a full-term infant struggling for air was handed over. For paramedics, the priority was saving the child. They did not stop to challenge her story. At Advocate Christ Medical Center in Oak Lawn, intake staff grew uneasy. Obstetric nurses are trained to assess postpartum patients. The woman's body did not align with her claim. Staff flagged the discrepancy in their notes and later relayed it to law enforcement. The infant was rushed into intensive care, placed on life support. While the child fought for survival, detectives compared DNA samples. The match was immediate and confirmed. The infant belonged to Marlene Ochoa Lopez and her husband. That confirmation closed a loop that had begun with the missing person report. A pregnant woman vanishes. A baby appears in suspicious hands. Now science tied them together. But how did Marlene reach that address on West 77th Place? That answer came through digital forensics. Subpoenas to Facebook produced private messages between Marlene and Clarissa. The thread was direct. Clarissa had posted in a Facebook group for expectant mothers, offering free baby clothes. Marlene responded politely, arranging to pick them up. The digital record was precise. Timestamps of messages, IP addresses confirming the origin, and Marlene's acceptance of the offer. Working backward, investigators examined call logs. Marlene's phone last connected to a tower near the southwest side shortly before she went silent. That coverage area included the house where the 911 call originated. The alignment between digital communications, cell tower data, and the timeline of the medical emergency was too tight to ignore. At this stage, detectives were still careful. In American criminal investigations, you don't leap ahead with assumptions. Evidence has to build layer by layer. The preliminary theory was that Marlene had been lured under false pretenses. The working evidence was the Facebook exchange and the hospital anomalies. The confirmed evidence was the DNA match. Interviews with medical staff reinforced the suspicion. Nurses recalled that Clarissa appeared calm, even rehearsed, when she presented herself as the newborn's mother. They described her as insistent, asking for certain medical interventions, and speaking as though she had prepared for this moment. One nurse later testified that she felt something was off, but could not legally intervene beyond noting it in the chart. Detectives logged these accounts carefully. Eyewitness testimony from medical professionals carries weight, especially when paired with hard science. The lack of postpartum signs was not speculation. It was medical fact. Attention turned back to the residence. Detectives ran records on the property. It was a modest home in a working-class neighborhood owned by Clarissa Figueroa's family. Clarissa lived there with her adult daughter, Desiree. Neighbors recalled seeing Marlene's car parked on the block weeks earlier. No one reported seeing her leave. When asked about the infant, Clarissa told officers she had given birth at home, supported by her daughter. Desiree confirmed the story in early interviews. But the problem for both women was the evidence. DNA does not bend to personal accounts. The baby was Marlene's, not Clarissa's. The investigation began tightening. Prosecutors were briefed. The pieces now included a pregnant woman missing, a body showing signs of ligature strangulation, an infant presented under false maternity, and digital records documenting how the victim was lured to the house. For a Cook County prosecutor, the question was no longer if a crime had occurred. It was how to prove who carried it out and secure admissible evidence for trial. In cases like this, investigators always consider negative evidence alongside positive. Clarissa had no medical records of prenatal care. No witnesses could confirm her pregnancy. Her work and insurance files showed nothing. It was as if a full-term pregnancy appeared overnight, an impossibility. The absence of supporting records became its own form of evidence. Detectives drafted affidavits for warrants. They seized computers, cell phones, and digital devices from the Figueroa residence. Analysts combed through them, focusing on internet searches, message histories, and deleted content. What they found lined up with the timeline: searches for pregnancy, labor, and infant care, but none for obstetric appointments or routine maternal health. The digital trail spoke louder than personal claims. Meanwhile, Marlon's family continued their search, holding vigils, demanding answers. For them, the disappearance was personal agony. For investigators, it was now a mapped sequence of evidence: digital invitations, a meeting, silence, a body, and a newborn caught between life and death. Every crime story has a point where probability turns into certainty. In this case, that turning point was the DNA match. It transformed suspicion into proof. With that, the Chicago Police Department and Cook County prosecutors began preparing formal charges. The story was no longer about a missing teenager. It was about homicide, deception, and the deliberate targeting of a vulnerable victim. For the investigators, the next step was clear: move from gathering evidence to securing admissions and building a courtroom case. The shift from forensics to victimology often exposes details the crime scene alone cannot explain. By early May 2019, detectives in Chicago began piecing together not just how Marlene Ochoa Lopez had died, but who she was in life, and what circumstances placed her within reach of those who would exploit her. Marlene was 19 years old, married, and a mother already. She and her husband, Giovanni Lopez, were raising a young son while preparing to welcome a second child. Friends and church members described her as soft-spoken and dedicated. She split her time between classes at an alternative high school and responsibilities at home. Investigators confirmed that she had been active in a local Latino youth program and regularly attended services at her neighborhood church. This context mattered. Victimology is not about character judgment. It is about risk assessment. Law enforcement needed to understand what routines or vulnerabilities might have intersected with predatory behavior. Digital records showed that Marlene frequently used social media, especially Facebook groups dedicated to mothers, expecting mothers, and secondhand baby items. These groups were community-driven but unregulated. Anyone could join, anyone could post. When detectives subpoenaed Facebook's records, they retrieved the full message history between Marlene and a user later identified as Clarissa Figueroa. The messages began innocently: offers of free baby clothes, small talk about infant care. The conversation showed no threats, no hostility, nothing that would raise immediate alarm. To Marlene, it appeared like a gesture of kindness from one mother to another. For investigators, the pattern looked different. The digital timestamps showed repeated contact, persistent follow-ups, and an unusual eagerness from the older woman to meet in person. Detectives noted that Clarissa had posted images of baby supplies on open groups, portraying herself as supportive of young mothers. That digital trail would later prove essential in court, but in spring 2019, it was simply a lead, one that connected a missing teenager to a stranger with unusual interest. The escalation phase of the investigation became clearer. Marlene's car had been found abandoned not far from the Figueroa residence. Witness canvassing placed her vehicle parked on the same block on the day she went missing. For police, the convergence of digital evidence and physical geography was a turning point. At the same time, detectives interviewed Marlene's family and close friends. They described her as cautious, not reckless, but also trusting. She wanted to build connections with other mothers her age. Several friends confirmed she had mentioned the plan to pick up baby items from a lady she met online. It was not unusual in her community. Informal exchanges of clothes, formula, and cribs were common. But in hindsight, that trust became the fatal link. Investigators also reviewed school attendance records and security camera footage from her campus. On the day she disappeared, Marlene had left classes early. That detail tightened the timeline. She exited the school building around midday, then her phone activity dropped off shortly after. There were no outgoing calls, no further social media posts. For detectives trained in digital forensics, such sudden silence was an anomaly, one consistent with a victim being intercepted or incapacitated. The victimology profile painted a picture of opportunity. Marlene's youth, pregnancy, and openness to community support made her a target. The lure of free baby supplies was not random. It was tailored. Detectives recognized this as premeditation disguised as generosity. By the second week of May, investigators confirmed through hospital records that Clarissa had appeared at Advocate Christ Medical Center claiming to have given birth. Staff found it suspicious at the time. The woman showed no physical signs of postpartum recovery, yet she presented a newborn in distress. Hospital personnel followed protocol, initiating life-saving measures for the infant and documenting the encounter. Those medical notes became part of the case file, lining up precisely with the period after Marlene went missing. This alignment, social media contact, abandoned car, family testimony, hospital records, created a mosaic of escalation. It was not one single clue, but the accumulation of small, consistent data points that narrowed the suspect pool. Detectives built their timeline not from speculation, but from verifiable logs, message histories, intake records, camera footage, and statements. On a human level, victimology also illuminated the cruelty of the crime. Marlene was not reckless. She was targeted for her very identity, young, expecting, and seeking community. In many American cities, immigrant and working-class families depend on online groups for support. That trust, once weaponized, turned fatal. It left investigators not just solving a homicide, but confronting how easily community bonds could be manipulated. The question investigators asked themselves was blunt. If a 19-year-old could be lured this way, how many others might be at risk? That question extended beyond this crime. It raised awareness of digital vulnerabilities, especially for women in late pregnancy seeking affordable support. And for detectives, escalation now meant urgency. They had enough to move from suspicion toward formal charges, but they needed to prove beyond doubt that the lure was intentional, that Marlene entered the residence alive, and that she never left. By late May, prosecutors were working closely with detectives, preparing to translate this victimology into a theory of premeditated murder. In procedural terms, escalation had reached the threshold. What began as a missing person case was now documented as a deliberate homicide investigation, with digital evidence tying victim and suspects directly. By the third week of May 2019, detectives had gathered enough overlapping strands of evidence to present prosecutors with a coherent theory of homicide. What began as a missing person file was now formally reclassified as a murder investigation, with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office brought in to evaluate the evidence for charging. The process was not simply about naming suspects. Prosecutors required a narrative that could survive courtroom scrutiny, a timeline of digital interactions, corroborated by witness testimony, anchored by physical evidence, and free of contradiction. Every fact had to be arranged into a chain, each link reinforcing the next. The first link was Marlene Ochoa Lopez's disappearance. School records established when she left class. Digital records showed the final online exchanges. Her vehicle's location tied her to the block where Clarissa Figueroa lived. These were not assumptions, they were entries with timestamps, verifiable by third-party custodians. The second link was the hospital encounter. Staff documented Clarissa's arrival with a newborn in distress. Medical professionals noted the mismatch between her physical condition and the claim of childbirth. That discrepancy became one of the most persuasive data points, because it originated from neutral observers with no stake in the outcome. Their notes, entered into hospital logs, carried evidentiary weight. The third link was forensic confirmation. Chain of custody protocols ensured that DNA samples from the infant were preserved and compared against Marlene's known genetic profile. Within days, results confirmed that the baby was biologically Marlene's. This scientific confirmation eliminated any alternative explanation. When detectives presented this triad of links, timeline, hospital anomaly, DNA confirmation, to prosecutors, the outline of a charging theory took shape. It was not just that Marlene had disappeared. It was that her disappearance was directly tied to another woman's possession of her child. Prosecutors in Cook County built their strategy in phases. The first phase was securing the suspects. Clarissa and her daughter Desiree were questioned, with statements that investigators later described as inconsistent. Neither provided a plausible account of how the infant came into their custody. The absence of a credible alternative explanation was itself damaging. Silence and contradiction can weigh heavily once digital and forensic records are introduced. The second phase was determining charges. Homicide was clear, but prosecutors debated how to classify the crime under Illinois law. Ultimately, they filed charges of first-degree murder, aggravated battery of a child, and concealment of a homicide. Desiree faced additional charges as an accomplice. The charging documents relied on plain language. Marlene Ochoa Lopez was lured to a residence under false pretenses, strangled, and her unborn child was forcibly removed. The documents also emphasized the calculated deception on social media. In court filings, prosecutors described the Facebook communications as pretextual inducements, a phrase underscoring premeditation. What made the theory powerful was its consistency. Each element, social media lure, disappearance, hospital visit, DNA confirmation, stacked in chronological order, leaving little room for defense counsel to argue coincidence. Prosecutors did not need dramatic claims. They had verifiable facts. Investigators also prepared to neutralize potential defenses. One anticipated argument was that Clarissa may have acted in a state of psychological instability rather than with premeditation. To counter this, prosecutors pointed to her prior Facebook posts about losing an adult son and her explicit statements about wanting to raise another child. These records suggested deliberate planning, not spontaneous breakdown. Another anticipated defense was lack of direct evidence of the strangulation itself. There was no surviving witness to the killing inside the residence. Prosecutors responded by highlighting cumulative circumstantial evidence. Marlene entered the house alive. She never left. Her vehicle was abandoned nearby, and her infant was presented at a hospital by the resident of that same house. Circumstantial evidence, when aligned, can be as persuasive as direct testimony. By June 2019, the indictment was secured. Both Clarissa and Desiree Figueroa were formally charged, held without bail, and presented in court for initial appearances. Media coverage intensified, framing the case as one of the most disturbing crimes in recent Chicago history. For investigators, the charging theory accomplished two goals. It gave prosecutors the framework to hold suspects accountable, and it validated the procedural work. Digital subpoenas, witness canvassing, hospital record retrieval, and forensic DNA analysis. Each discipline had contributed to the outcome. The larger significance extended beyond this single crime. Prosecutors emphasized in press conferences that community members should remain cautious when responding to online offers. The same digital tools that create connection can also be exploited. In this case, a 19-year-old's vulnerability intersected with another person's calculated deception. In court, prosecutors laid out the timeline with precision. They avoided speculation, sticking to timestamps and records. Jurors would later hear those same points, but the charging documents were the first time the narrative was locked into a prosecutorial frame. For Marlene's family, the indictment was a moment of partial relief. It did not restore their daughter, but it assured them that the justice system recognized the gravity of the crime. Church leaders in Chicago echoed the sentiment, calling for vigilance and stronger awareness around the hidden dangers of digital interactions. As investigators transitioned their role to trial preparation, they continued to refine evidence presentation. Surveillance logs, DNA chain of custody, social media records, all were collated into exhibits. Each exhibit would eventually be scrutinized in court. The challenge was to present them without gaps, ensuring that jurors saw a continuous narrative rather than scattered fragments. From a law enforcement perspective, this stage of the process highlights a universal truth. Solving a crime is not enough. Prosecutors must be able to explain it step by step within the boundaries of law. That explanatory power, more than any single forensic result, determines whether a conviction is secured. The charging theory of May 2019 was clear. Marlene Ochoa Lopez was intentionally lured, deliberately killed, and her child was taken as part of a plan. With that structure in place, the focus turned toward the courtroom, where defense attorneys would test each claim and where the emotional weight of the crime would confront the letter of the law. The transition from investigation to courtroom is often the moment when procedure collides with emotion. In Cook County, prosecutors knew the evidence in Marlene Ochoa Lopez's murder had to be presented with precision. The charges carried life-altering consequences, but so did the silence of a community that had watched a pregnant teenager vanish and then reappear only in the cold language of a coroner's file. Inside the Cook County Criminal Court building, the weight of the case was unmistakable. Clarissa Figueroa, then in her late 40s, faced charges of first-degree murder, aggravated battery of a child, and concealment of a homicidal death. Her daughter, Desiree, not yet 30 at the time of arrest, stood accused of assisting in the plot. Prosecutors framed it as premeditated, coordinated, and motivated by a disturbing attempt to claim an unborn child as their own. The courtroom atmosphere was clinical at first glance, wood paneling, court officers, file folders stacked in deliberate order. But beneath the formalities, every person present understood the violence that had brought them there. Jurors, screened for bias and asked about their exposure to media coverage, listened as the judge explained that their responsibility was not to speculate but to weigh evidence. The prosecution built its narrative carefully. They began with the timeline. Marlon's last known communications, the social media interaction that lured her to the Figueroa residence, and the sudden cessation of her digital footprint. Within minutes, the focus shifted from disappearance to homicide. Forensic experts testified to the DNA confirmation of the infant as Marlon's child. Cell site records placed her phone at the neighborhood where the Figueroas lived, aligning with witness testimony about her last movements. The jury was shown evidence that had already been established in pretrial hearings: the medical impossibility of Clarissa's claim to be the newborn's mother, the immediate hospital suspicions, and the contradiction of a woman presenting with a child but no signs of labor. These were not speculative anomalies. They were medical records entered into the court's chain of evidence. Defense attorneys attempted to shift responsibility. They argued Clarissa acted alone, that Desiree had been drawn in without full knowledge of the plan. They raised doubts about intent, whether the death was the product of calculated action or a confrontation gone tragically out of control. But prosecutors countered by pointing to Desiree's active role in misleading investigators and her assistance in luring Marlon into a dangerous setting. Witness testimony included law enforcement officers who described the consistency of digital evidence, hospital staff who noted the physiological discrepancies in Clarissa's account, and forensic pathologists who explained the confirmed cause of death as homicide by ligature strangulation. Each layer of testimony reinforced the prosecution's theory of deliberate, coordinated violence. For Marlon's family, seated in the gallery, the legal language was both validating and painful. Each mention of her name, each reference to the child who later died in neonatal intensive care, reopened grief that was still raw years later. Yet it also served as recognition that Marlon's story would not be buried in paperwork. After weeks of hearings, plea negotiations emerged as the likely resolution. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Clarissa Figueroa accepted a plea agreement in 2023. She admitted responsibility for Marlon's murder and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Her daughter Desiree entered a separate plea, acknowledging her role and receiving a 30-year sentence in 2024. For the state, the outcomes ensured long terms of incarceration. For the family, the sentences represented accountability, though not healing. In trials of this nature, legal closure rarely equates to emotional closure. Community members, especially in Chicago's Latino neighborhoods, emphasized that Marlene had been 19, a young mother preparing for her second child, trusting enough to answer what appeared to be an offer of help. That trust had been manipulated, and it cost her life. The judge addressed the courtroom directly at sentencing, underscoring the brutality of the crime and the enduring consequences for the victim's family. Legal terminology framed the punishment, but beneath the words was a recognition of profound loss. A teenager who never returned home, an infant who lived only briefly, and a family marked permanently. By the time the gavel signaled the end of proceedings, the procedural side of the case was complete. Files were archived, sentences recorded, and the names Clarissa and Desiree Figueroa entered permanently into Illinois Department of Corrections records. But for those who followed the crime, the conclusion did not erase the beginning. It only underscored how one calculated act had unraveled multiple lives. As investigators reflected, the case demonstrated not only the importance of digital and forensic evidence, but also the fragility of human trust. Crime, in its starkest form, often depends on manipulation as much as force. Marlene Ochoa Lopez's death became a reminder that legal systems can deliver accountability, but prevention lies in vigilance and community awareness. When sentencing was handed down in Chicago, the courtroom marked the legal closure of the Marlene Ochoa Lopez case. Clarissa Figueroa received 50 years, her daughter Desiree 30. For the record, the state delivered justice. For Marlene's family, however, the grief remained permanent. Community groups used her story as a warning about the risks of online contact during pregnancy. Police emphasized how fast digital records and hospital alerts converged to expose the crime. Hospitals reviewed maternity protocols, ensuring that such deception could not pass unchallenged again. For Marlene's young son, who lost his mother at 3 years old, relatives stepped in to raise him. They kept her name alive in daily life, understanding that justice on paper does not replace a mother's presence. The media revisited the case on anniversaries, framing it as more than a homicide. It was a breach of community trust. Social platforms intended for support became tools of manipulation. In neighborhoods like Chicago's Southwest Side, the crime symbolized how quickly trust can turn fatal. By 2024, both defendants were in Illinois prisons. The files were closed, but the impact was not. Families, investigators, and advocates agreed on one point: punishment measures accountability, but loss measures generations. Clarissa Figueroa is serving 50 years, her daughter Desiree, 30. The court closed the record, but the harm endures. Marlene Ochoa Lopez, only 19 and expecting her second child, never returned home. What remains is accountability on paper, and an empty space in her family. Chicago adjusted. Faster alerts between hospitals and police, tighter reviews of online lures, and stronger community safety messages. The lesson is direct. Predators often hide behind trust. A simple offer of baby clothes became a doorway to a crime that stole a young mother's life. Justice was secured because digital records, medical evidence, and consistent witness accounts lined up. The sentences reflected proof, not speculation. Still, punishment cannot equal the loss. For Marlene's husband, her son, and her parents, grief is the daily verdict. Her story carries a warning, but also a duty. Meet safely, verify, and protect one another. Crime thrives on silence and misplaced trust. Prevention begins with vigilance. Status closed. Sentences imposed. This crime leaves a permanent mark and a lesson that vigilance saves lives. Looking back on Marlene's story, I can't help but remind myself, and you, that safety often lies in the smallest choices. Meeting strangers, trusting too quickly, overlooking red flags, these are the cracks where tragedy can enter. Her life was stolen, and her child was lost, but the lesson she leaves us is urgent. Protect yourself, protect your community, and never ignore your instincts. Now I'd love to hear from you. What part of this crime struck you most? How do you think we, as neighbors and families, can better safeguard each other? Share your thoughts below, even just where you're watching from, so we can connect as a community. And if this story touched you, please subscribe to this channel to follow more true crime reports that shed light, honor victims, and remind us all why awareness matters.